these event. Um, and Grace, you can see here, Cindy Skukroot is the chair of our committee, and she's somewhere on here, but Scott Kuykendall is also part of this team. So we are so pleased to have you with us today for this important topic. Before we begin the event, we'd ask that you please turn off your cameras and your mics. The event will be recorded and shown on YouTube. So if you can turn off your cameras and your mics, that will be very helpful. So today's event will be a talk only, as it is a follow-up to the one that our speaker, Dennis Dreher, led last summer at Boloria Meadows. It's our belief that this information is so important about natural areas management for HOAs that we want to share it with as wide of an audience as possible. Thus, Dennis's presentation, as I said, will be recorded and shared on the Defenders YouTube channel. More BMP talks and tours will follow this event in upcoming months, so we hope you will join us for those events as well. Today's talk will cover successful natural area management at the McAndrews Glen subdivision in Bull Valley, where Dennis, a Geosyntec Consultant and volunteer steward at the Boloria Meadows Nature Preserve, located adjacent to the subdivision, he'll be discussing elements of successful management of 25 acres of natural area in McAndrews Glen by the HOA hired to care for it. So Dennis, thanks so much for sharing this important information, and take it away.
Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everyone to the webinar. I was joking beforehand, I have to apologize that the weather is so nice today because obviously we'd probably rather be outside than listening to a webinar. Somehow we're in the middle of our presentation, so maybe we can back it up to the beginning. Is that possible, Grace? Thank you. It may be on automatic advance, I was thinking, so let's make sure it's not. But anyway, welcome. And as Nancy said, I'm with Geosyntec Consultants. My background is actually in engineering, but I've been doing as a volunteer and a contractor and a site steward, I've been doing ecological restoration and site management for close to 30 years. And I advise my homeowners association at McAndrews Glen on working with contractors and kind of supervising contractors and that kind of thing. So in a nutshell, that's my background. So, Grace, it doesn't seem to be advancing on my end, so maybe you can go to the next slide. So we're going to cover a number of topics today. Just a little bit of background information about McAndrews Glen first, then the role of the homeowners association. And this is not exactly the same order, but hiring and overseeing natural area contractors, which is critical to making this all work. What role local governments might have, if any. The objectives and tasks that contractors will have on a particular site. Talk a little bit about the costs and benefits, although I'm sure most of you are aware of this, but if you're not convinced in terms of maybe switching over to doing more of a natural approach in your HOA, there's some pretty compelling, basically cost and benefit figures. And then also, somewhat unique to McHenry County, talk about some opportunities to cooperate with the land conservancy organizations, in this case, the Land Conservancy of McHenry County. So as Nancy, you can go to the next slide. As Nancy mentioned, we actually did this back in, I think it was July, and it was a 90+ degree day. So it's probably a lot more comfortable sitting and watching this webinar today, but it was nice to actually get people out into the field and kind of get a sense to see and feel what we talk about when we talk about natural area management, what constitutes a well-managed site, that kind of thing. Next slide. As mentioned, we're going to be focusing on the development that I live in, which is McAndrews Glen in Bull Valley. McAndrews Glen is off of Bull Valley Road, kind of between Ridge Road to the west and Draper Road to the east. It's about a 50-acre development, but it's what's considered a clustered residential development, which means the houses are kind of clustered around open space. And this slide, although it's a little bit cut off by our names, by our faces, this site has about 20+ acres of natural area. It has 25 acres, 20 acres that we're managing as prairie, including 4 different detention basins, We also have kind of a unique arrangement here where part of the development backs up. This is to the area in the upper left-hand corner of the slide, backs up to a 60-acre nature preserve called Boloria Meadows, which is owned by the Land Conservancy in McHenry County. So we have some interesting opportunities and synergies to work with the Land Conservancy and the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission to manage some parts of the site that are right on the border. Next slide. And that's what I was just referring to. These different designations in the upper left are management units within the nature preserve, and then the areas F and then D on the lower left are actually areas within the HOA that are being managed potentially by the HOA, but also sometimes by the Nature Preserves Commission and the Land Conservancy. Let me go on to the next slide. Did someone someone was kind of raising their hand there? Are we okay or good to go? All right, we'll continue. In terms of the area that we're managing, as I mentioned, it's about 25 acres. It's mostly in prairie, again, with 4 detention basins scattered around. I would say that overall, the condition of the area that we're managing is excellent, but we do have certain areas and certain problematic, I guess I'll say, issues and invasive species that we're focusing on that might be in maybe roughly 20% of the overall 20 acres that we're managing. But this is a fairly typical view. This is actually behind my house. This is an easement area that features a lot of, this is midsummer, native prairie grasses and wildflowers. We'll talk a little bit more about the wildflowers in just a minute. Next slide. So at least on my screen, some of these titles are being cut off, but I don't know if we can fix that or not. But these are typical flowers that we would see in the early spring. So typically in May, things like golden alexander and Ohio spiderwort. Not a lot blooming in the spring, but if we move to the summer, next slide, this is when the area really starts showing off with things like butterfly milkweed. This is white baptisia. I can see some prairie dock leaves. So it's really fairly diverse. A little bit about species diversity. When this was first planted, I believe it had roughly 4 or 5 different species of grasses and probably 30, maybe to 40 species of wildflowers. That's been, I guess, added to a little bit over time just by us spreading some seed and sharing seed with some adjacent areas. So it's fairly diverse with flowers blooming basically from May through at least October. Next slide.
Hey, and just to reassure you, Dennis, we are seeing your full slides on our
Oh, good.
screen.
Okay. That's good. Thank you. So we jump into the next slides. We've got some Culver's root, some more purple coneflower. We've got rattlesnake master with the catchy monarch butterfly on it. Next slide. We have some really tall prairie dock here on the left that kind of borders our trail system. We have purple prairie clover. A lot of these species are really important for bee and also butterfly nectar. Just as a quick aside, we do butterfly monitoring in the adjacent nature preserve, and we have, I think, about 35 different species of butterflies. We also have at least 6 or 7 species of bumblebee, including, I think I can mention this, we have in the nature preserve, we have the rusty patch bumblebee, which is a federally endangered species. Next slide. Getting into late summer and fall, this would be August, September, October. We have cream gentian, stiff goldenrod. Next slide. And a bunch of different aster species. I think this may be, I'm not even sure what they are. I think it's New England aster on the right. I'm not so good on my asters, but needless to say, we have a lot of things blooming basically through the entire growing season. Next slide. One thing I want to mention too, we often kind of focus on prairie wildflowers because they're the things that attract people's attention. They're the things that bring beauty, and also, they're host plants for butterflies and bees, as I mentioned. It's absolutely critical in your native plantings, whether it's an HOA area or it's any kind of natural area, to have a diversity of grasses. Typically, grasses would be anywhere from 40% to 60% of the overall mix, and grasses are important in particular because they provide structure and they provide fuel for control burns, which we'll talk a little bit about later. Next slide. So I'm going to stop for just 1 second. Do we have any questions on the background before we get into the meat of the conversation? We'll stop along the way, and if people do have questions, we'll answer them. But we'll also save some time at the end for a Q&A session. All right, we'll move on then. The HOA role. Oops. Yeah, next slide. Next slide. So the homeowners association, and again, this is going to vary a little bit probably from one HOA to another, but in broad terms, the HOA is responsible for funding and also overseeing the natural area management. And in our case, we're focusing specifically on controlling invasive species and conducting regular control burns. We also have covenants within our HOA that established basically what is the area that we're managing, and also include some criteria and provisions to discourage waste dumping and similar things, just so residents are aware of what their role is and what they're certainly encouraged to spend time within the conservation area, within that open space, but not to do things that would be negative to it. We also try to communicate at least annually with our HOA members at our annual meeting about things that are going on. We also have a separate newsletter, which is not all that regular, with the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, that we share with the HOA members in terms of, again, ongoing activities and things to be aware of and that kind of thing. And then finally, the HOA hires and supervises the contractors that do the work within the natural area. Next slide. So one of the questions that often comes up is, who do I hire to do this work? Who's good? How do I know how to hire someone? And I'll say right off the bat, there used to be a list of recognized, not necessarily certified because there's not a certification system, but recognized contractors who do this kind of work. That list no longer exists. So now we kind of fall back to certain criteria. And I would encourage you very strongly, maybe you can just jot this down, or I guess this will also be online when we're done. This is one of the most critical and important resources. The document is called Native Landscape and Ecological Restoration Guide, Recommendations for Contractor Selection, Project Specifications, Performance Standards, Monitoring and Management Guidelines, and Institutional Arrangements. So this is, it's about a 50-page document, fairly straightforward, but it was specifically written for HOAs, park districts, municipalities, folks that aren't necessarily trained and don't have the expertise in this subject area. So definitely refer to this. Next slide. One of the things that this guide includes is a list of criteria for evaluating the qualifications of various contractors. And I'll say that in broad terms, we're probably in a very good situation in Northeast Illinois. I would say that we have probably as many good qualified natural area contractors for management of natural areas, and also, frankly, for establishment and restoration work of natural areas of any region in the country. There are at least 8 or 10 really good firms that do work in this area, and there's some smaller firms as well. But some of the questions you'll want to consider in terms of whether a particular firm is qualified or not is, what is their work experience? How long they've been working in this field? You don't want to just select a typical landscape contractor that does mostly turf grass management and says, oh, I can do a burn, I can kill invasive species, because they really don't have the qualifications most likely. Are they familiar with performance standards? Do they know what it means to say that they're controlling invasive species? And typically performance criteria would be something along the lines of, 90% of the species on the site are native species and a very small fraction are invasive species. Can they demonstrate success? Do they have other clients they've worked with? Can they share with you references on the sites they've worked on that you can, investigate on your own? One other important criteria, maybe one of the most important, will they have experienced staff on the site for all of their site visits? And for our site, we typically have probably 3 or 4 visits every growing season to control invasive species. And in alternate years, we do control burns. For some of the landscape contractors, their business model is they'll have one skilled, highly skilled, expert leading a group of 3 or 4 other individuals who may be much less experienced, and they may even be summer trainees. So that will work on some sites when the problems are very obvious and straightforward. On other sites where the problems and the target invasive species are a little bit more tricky, that probably will not work real well. And I can actually say, in our case, we've actually gone through and through mutual agreement in most cases, decided we want to move on to another contractor. As our site gets better and our focus gets a little bit more fine-tuned, we'll look at another contractor maybe to do the work. It's also critically important that their staff are trained pesticide applicators, and there's a certain licensing process you can go through for that. So that's important, and also that they have experience and qualifications and also insurance for doing control burns. And as I mentioned above, definitely seek references from them for similar work that they've done. Next slide. I want to jump off. Actually, let's stop there for 1 second. Any questions on what I just talked about in terms of the HOA role and kind of interfacing with contractors before we move on? All right, hearing none, we'll move on to the local government role. And again, this is going to vary quite a bit from community to community. In our case, we are within the village of Bull Valley. Bull Valley does not have really an active ongoing role, but they did have a very critical role in the initiation of this development, essentially. We wouldn't be having a natural area to manage if they didn't intervene in the approval process and ask for a certain type of development, which is essentially, as I showed you before in the map, a clustered residential development where the homes are clustered onto smaller lots around a network of open space. So basically, they required that initial development design and then also required that the developer address the long-term preservation and management of that area through covenants. And again, as I mentioned, this is going to vary a little bit from community to community. We do have some fairly progressive communities in McHenry County who have taken this a step forward, where they have detailed language within their ordinances for these kind of what I'll call conservation developments, for covenants, backup special service areas in case things aren't going as well as they might. The city or the village could actually take over management. They require certain funding arrangements. There might be ownership or easement arrangements. And even in some cases, and I'll talk about this toward the end, working with the Land Conservancy in McHenry County, there might be monitoring and performance criteria, which are very specific and numerical, that will judge whether or not the HOA is basically doing the job in working with contractors to maintain the site to a certain level. And I don't want to get negative here, but I will say, and maybe that's why some of you are participating today, there are far too many examples of HOA, open space, natural areas that aren't performing particularly well, in part because these kind of criteria weren't there in the first place, and also because the HOA didn't really have a whole lot of expertise in working with contractors, didn't know what it was supposed to be doing, that kind of thing. One of the better examples actually in the entire state of Illinois is the McHenry County Conservation Design Ordinance, which is embedded in the county's Unified Development Ordinance. And there's actually, I believe, similar language in Crystal Lake and Algonquin for conservation development. So they basically cover all the bullet points above, very thorough in addressing what needs to be in place as a site is developed, as a natural area is planted, and then taking it through into perpetuity. So we can move to the next slide. So I'm going to change topic again. Any questions on the role of local governments before we move on? Okay, this is probably the core element of the entire presentation. So what are the objectives when you're working with contractors, and what are the specific tasks you're hiring them to do? In our case, the broad objective, and I'm actually going to read this, is to achieve a landscape that is dominated by desirable native vegetation, relatively free of invasive species. You're never going to get rid of all of them, but they should be definitely in the very, very small minority of species present, and also control of aggressive native species. And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by aggressive native species. The principal tasks that we are working on with our contractors are control of, again, herbaceous and woody undesirable species. So it's not just, weeds like thistle, it's also things like buckthorn and honeysuckle and a few others that might move into some areas. We specifically identify an approach. We work very closely with our contractor, talked about herbiciding approaches, cutting brush, hand pulling weeds where appropriate, and also selective mowing of certain species. The approach we take is basically to use the least amount of chemical and the most targeted chemical we can to target those invasive species and minimize any adverse impact to adjacent areas. Because obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, you could go in with lots of chemical, something like Roundup, and just spray a whole area. What happens? You get a dead zone, which is then going to fill up with weeds. So we're very careful and conscious in working with our contractors to make sure that we're doing this very targeted approach. As I mentioned, we also do control burning. Control burning, we do on an alternating years basis. So we burned our property last year. We won't burn this year. We'll burn the following year. And I'll talk a little bit more about it, but control burning is really one of the most important things you can do in maintaining the natural conditions that have historically always been present for native prairies in Northeast Illinois. I'll also talk a little bit about overseeding, which means basically if there are certain areas that aren't doing well at all and they're not going to be getting filled in by adjacent species, we may have to come in and do some remedial seeding to those areas. So next slide. These are some of our common invasive species. We don't have a huge list, but there are some things that are particularly notable. In some cases, they'll vary from year to year. Starting on the left-hand side, this is yellow sweet clover. We also have white sweet clover. This is a biennial weed, meaning it takes 2 years to come to flower. We've had big blooms in some years and almost none in other years. This is something you probably can hand pull if there's not a lot of it, but you might have to spray if you do have a lot of it. In the upper middle is one of the worst. Please don't get this on your site. This is crown vetch. We did not have this for years, and it just appeared literally 3 or 4 years ago in a few spots. And I'm not even sure how it got on the site. I'm going to make a quick aside here. When you're working with contractors, make sure that they have a protocol when they send workers to your site that they scrub their boots. I'm being serious about this. So there isn't mud or debris from adjacent sites where they may have been working on a really nasty area, because they can literally bring in seeds from certain invasive species to another site. They can also drift in on the wind or with birds and that kind of thing. So I'm not saying that's where this came from, but we now have 5 small locations where crown vetch exists. To the right, we have sort of a combination of willows around one of our detention ponds, and in the foreground, very nasty, looks like Canada, probably bull thistle. So we have different kinds of thistles. Thistles are typically, the ones we have here are typically non-native, and they are definitely problematic. In the lower portion, we have reed canary grass, which is typically found in wetlands, but also can bloom in some of the adjacent upland areas. And again, definitely needs to be treated. Next slide.
Dennis, we have a question, and the
Okay.
question is, what is the best way you have found to control crown vetch? And it appears, Nancy said it appeared at one of our sites and we're fighting it off.
Okay, so I'm going to suggest you use a chemical called Transline. That's actually the brand name. I can't think offhand. We actually have probably some people on our group here who are more expert, but it's a very selective chemical. It only targets certain types of wildflowers, composites, which includes some of the sunflowers and things like that, but will not kill grasses or sedges and many of the other wildflowers. So it's used in very low concentration. It probably will need to be this patch where it's already in flower, will probably be needed to be treated over a couple of years. One thing we do with our contractors is whenever we identify some species like this, it's going to be persistent. We actually ask them to geo-reference it or GPS it. They've got the technology, so they know where to come back from year to year. So I can probably get into that a little bit more, but that's the chemical we use, Transline. One other target species I will mention, and this is something that, it's a bad one. This is something called calorie pear, which is widely planted by municipality. I shouldn't say by municipalities, but also residents. It was a very popular one among the landscaping and nursery industry in Illinois, but it's highly invasive. This is on the left-hand side. This is the flowering portion. On the right-hand side, this is when it's going into its fall colors. And you can see the little fruit. The fruit gets eaten by the birds. It gets spread around. This can literally dominate an entire site. So be very careful about the spreading of this. I think there's now, and someone can probably verify this, there's now a state ban on introduction and use of calorie pear through plantings, but it's already in the landscape, so it's going to be spreading, but it's something you definitely want to be on top of. Next slide. In addition to targeting invasive species, and invasives are generally identified as species that do not exist as part of the natural species that would have occurred historically. So it's not a native species, and it's also very weedy. We do have weedy native species. And two examples, you may not believe it, but giant ragweed and common ragweed are both native species. They're actually pollinator plants, but they're not good in a native planting like this, especially when they can dominate in some areas. And the image on the left is an area we have. It's actually technically not in the HOA. It's adjacent in the nature preserve. This is tall, or giant ragweed that's as much as 12 feet tall. So before it goes to seed, we weed whack it. It's like going into a tropical forest. And unfortunately, it doesn't go to flower until probably July. So it's not a fun activity to do on a hot July day. On the right-hand side is tall goldenrod in the foreground, just coming into bloom. And then those are willows in the background that have been partially treated. Willows tend to establish around detention ponds. And again, while a few willows may not be problematic, they don't obey the rule of sticking to a few. They will spread very aggressively around detention ponds and wet areas in particular. And so if you let them go, they will dominate those areas. And they can grow, again, probably 12, 15 feet tall, and they can really become a problematic species. And then tall goldenrod in the foreground here is, again, a native species, but it tends to grow in monocultures. It's all connected. It's rhizomatous underground. It will dominate your preferred native prairie planting. So much better to go with other goldenrod species like stiff goldenrod, Riddell's goldenrod, showy goldenrod, etc. So those are species we manage. Fortunately for both the goldenrod and the giant ragweed, we can do selective mowing or weed whacking. Things like the willows and other invasive and non-native aggressive woody plants, you can do some foliar spraying, but in some cases it's best to cut them at the stem and then treat the stem with herbicides so they don't regrow. Next slide. As I mentioned, controlled burning is absolutely critical. We're in an alternate year regimen here. We burn basically the entire HOA area. And again, we're working with contractors that are highly skilled. They have the right equipment. In this case, this is actually a crew from the Land Conservancy that we did a burn with last week. They need to have equipment like ATVs with water tanks. When you're burning prairies in particular, the flames can get very tall, and you can't trust fire breaks to put the fire out. So you need to have a crew that's going to have water and other appropriate equipment, and also the experience and skill in working with these kind of fuels. So One question is, why do you burn so often? And again, part of it is historically the prairies and frankly the wetlands and the woodlands of northeastern Illinois are used to this kind of burning. If you don't burn very often, and some folks have suggested, well, we'll just burn every 3 or 4 or 5 years, we can save some money. In the meantime, you're going to see cool season grasses like Kentucky bluegrass moving in from neighboring lawns, which can eventually dominate the native grasses. You're going to see other weeds move in that would be kept in check to some extent by control burning, in particular, small brush species, even things like calorie pear. The very first year when the seedlings are coming up, if you can do a burn, those seedlings probably won't survive. If they've had 2 or 3 or 4 years to grow, the fire will not kill them. The other reason for doing frequent burning, and we can see this very readily on our site, burning stimulates the blooming of native wildflowers. It looks far better in the years after we burn in terms of wildflower blooming and also, again, the pollinator species that they attract in the years after a burn. And even some of our residents who are kind of skeptical early on, kind of the notion, let nature take its course. We don't want to be spending all this money. Why are you hiring contractors? We don't need to manage this area. They now are probably the most ardent individuals in suggesting or asking, when are you going to burn? When's the next burn? Some even have suggested we burn every year, which we probably won't do because we want some refugia for insects and that kind of thing. And we alternate some of our burns with the nature preserve immediately adjacent. But those are some of the critical reasons for burning. So don't skimp in your budget. Make sure you include regular burning as a contractor specified item. Next slide.
Dennis, we have another question.
Sure.
They're saying, is there a time or schedule of when these burns happen? Is there a notification list or email that I can be added to? I guess, is this an open call for volunteers to burn, or is this a closed burning?
Great questions. Okay, in terms of when to burn, typically it will be late fall. So after you've had a couple of good hard freezes and most of the green is out of your grasses, so you need those grasses really nice and dry to burn. Or if you're burning in the woods, you want the oak leaves down on the ground. You would burn until it gets to the point where it's getting really cold and wet. You need dry conditions. And again, there are certain criteria that contractors will use in terms of humidity, wind speed, temperature, how many days since the last rainfall event, that kind of thing. So you got a good fall window, but probably the best window is in the springtime. So these days, these years, it used to be basically just kind of March and April. Now with spring arriving so early, you probably can get a jump on things and start doing burning in February, probably through March, and depending on the site, you might be able to burn into early April. You want to basically wait until, again, you get the right conditions in terms of temperature and moisture, but you don't want to wait too long because if you wait too long, you get certain things greening up. And while, again, these plants are pretty tolerant, if you burn too late, some of your wildflowers might get kind of scorched. The ones that are just emerging from the ground, they'll reemerge, but they may not bloom that year. And another consideration is that things that are emerging when it gets to be 60 degrees, so a day like today, you'll probably find some snakes coming out, turtles coming out. And not to say that there aren't going to be, I hate to put it this way, there are going to be some casualties sometimes. And those things have all evolved with fire. So again, they can survive in terms of populations. But you probably want to select those days that are a little bit more cool. So 40s and 50s would be ideal burn days. But again, because we have a short window, some days we'll be burning on 60-degree days as well. In terms of volunteering, typically you wouldn't, well, you could do it within your own HOA, I suppose, if you could work with a contractor. For organizations like the Land Conservancy, which burns in the nature preserve, they do have a list of volunteers, some of whom are fairly well trained. So for example, in our last burn, we burned with just 2 staff from the Land Conservancy and 4 volunteers. And those are all people who are on their mailing list and are familiar with burning. So if you're interested, a great opportunity is if you're not already a member of the Land Conservancy, join the Land Conservancy and talk to them about being put on their volunteer list. And then you'll also be basically apprised of other volunteer activities like cutting brush and seeding and collecting seed and all the other fun stuff that's involved in restoration. So hopefully that answers the question.
And we have one other question from Cindy. How do you notify HOAs when the burns are going to happen, and and also neighboring homeowners, not necessarily just HOAs?
Oh, I wish I had a good answer to that one. So here's the deal. I'll get a notification because I'm not on the HOA board, but I am the liaison to the HOA. So I'll get some interaction with our contractor. We'll look at the weather coming up, and ideally the contractor will say, based on our schedule when we're available, based on weather conditions, and this might be a Friday. They'll say next Tuesday looks really good. So put us on the schedule. If that works out, we'll give you an update on Monday. So I'll let the HOA board know that. I'm not sure if anyone from my HOA board is attending, but I always ask them to notify residents. I don't think they typically do because I never get the notification myself in terms of an email. But I'll tell you, residents love to watch control burns. Now that they're used to it and they realize, we've got all the fire protection mechanisms in place, it's not going to burn their house down. It's very cool watching a control burn, and then watch over the intervening, a few weeks after the burn, watch that area green up and realize that you're going to have this big bloom of wildflowers in the spring. So that's how we interact with our HOA. And again, I wish there was a little bit better communication with residents, but I would, if you're representing a different HOA and you've got either an email list or a text list with your residents, definitely notify them so that they know when it's going to happen. If you can give them advance notification, and they frankly will enjoy watching the burns. And I'll often see people out on their decks just sitting back with a cup of coffee watching the burn go through behind their backyard. So it's a cool thing to watch. Next slide. So one of the issues that comes up sometimes, and again, as I mentioned, a lot of HOAs, a lot of natural areas in general, have problem areas that have gotten so bad they can't just keep on controlling the invasive species. They have essentially dead zones within their natural area that, can be problematic. And so what I've noticed here, and I've noticed probably in other cases as well, these problem areas tend to occur in particular areas. And so these are the areas, while you're hiring a contractor to, work on, in our case, 20 acres, they might spend most of their time on 3 or 4 acres. So typically around detention basins, you're often going to have cattails, phragmites, which is giant reed, which is something you definitely don't want. You might have the invading shrubs like the willows, which can really dominate. Real quickly on cattails, the way detention basins are designed by engineers and implemented by developers, they're basically natural cattail attractors. So I would say if you have a wet bottom detention basin and it's only a foot or 2 deep, it's going to be cattails. So you don't want to waste your entire budget on controlling cattails in those areas. So probably just let them go. If other species like Phragmites comes in, reed canary grass would be another of these shrubs, you definitely want to treat those. And that's how we approach it within our development. We do have some cattails that have come in one of our basins that is relatively dry, so we control them there. They've also come into one of our easements, growing in some wet areas that we have moisture from sump pumps, so we control it there. So that's something that, it's kind of a site-by-site consideration. Another challenging area is edges with residential yards. So we have 27 residential lots, all of which, I think almost all of which, we've got a few that don't back up to the natural area, but almost all of them back up to the HOA area. So what are the problems? We have waste dumping. They like to drop their grass clippings in some cases. It's addressed by our covenants, but landscape contractors, the guys that mow the lawns for the residents, don't read our covenants. So it's an ongoing battle. Herbicide drift is another. I'm probably one of only 2 or 3 residents in my neighborhood that doesn't use chemicals on my lawn. So when you're applying that chemical cocktail of pre-emergent, post-emergent, herbicides, those do seep and they drift into the adjacent natural area. So you're basically killing wildflowers. And it can be a problem. So we try to educate our residents about that, but it's only, there's only so much we can do. So we just have to recognize that we're going to have a few problem areas along those edges. The other thing is planting flammable trees and shrubs right next to a planted prairie. Colorado spruce, 5 feet away from a 6-foot tall, big blue stem planting, that spruce is going to get a little bit of heat every time you do a controlled burn. And when I say a little bit of heat, it's not going to like it. It's going to get some dead branches. So that's an ongoing kind of conversation we need to have. Some of those are already in place. So our HOA contractor that does the controlled burns is sometimes using his water tank to spray down some of these shrubs and frankly slowing things down and wasting time. So it is a consideration. The other consideration is edges with major roadways. So one of our major roadways at our entrance is Bull Valley Road, which is, a fairly high traffic arterial. It is regularly treated off, and also there's a spray as the cars drive by. So the edge of our natural area that is closest to Bull Valley Road is not very healthy. I can't guarantee that it's because of salt that gets on the vegetation and also contaminates the soil, but I say there's a high likelihood of that. So just be aware that condition exists, but you just have to deal with it. And obviously education and working with your local government, if you do have these kind of situations, is also something you should, I would encourage you to do. Next slide. So again, getting into this topic of what if you have these really degraded areas, and by degraded areas, I mean, highly degraded, I mean, relatively large areas, say an area that's 20 feet by 50 feet, where it's almost all invasive species. So you have woody vegetation, you have, again, purple loosestrife, you have crown vetch, whatever, and you're killing it. So you're applying, the appropriate chemicals, but it's not getting better. Similarly, if you have areas you don't have the native prairie grasses, which are it's essentially critical to getting your controlled burn. So when you burn the property, those areas just won't burn. Similarly, related, if these areas get big enough, even after you deal with the invasive species, there won't be nearby populations and seed sources where those native plants can reseed that area, then you have a problem. And in this case, again, in our case, we probably don't have anything quite this bad, so we're not starting from scratch, but we do have some adjacent neighboring HOAs where clearly you can see that's what's going on right now. Probably because they waited too long to either hire a contractor or got the right contractor to address their problem. So if you do have cases like that, whether it's small areas or large areas within your HOA natural area, you're essentially going to have to start from scratch, which means kill off the remaining invasives, reseed aggressively with native species in those areas, and it's going to take about 3 years for that area to basically come back to a healthy situation, and then just keep an eye on it in the meantime. I'll talk a little bit more about the costs and benefits, but if you do have to reseed, the typical costs, and I'm not going to tell you what a contractor is going to charge necessarily, but it's going to be roughly anywhere from $1,000 to $2,000 or more dollars per acre to reseed these highly degraded areas. So you want to avoid that situation because that's a budget item that your HOA probably has not planned for. So just be, again, cognizant of that and realize when you have to kind of bite the bullet and go back and start over in some areas. Next slide. I'm going to stop there and let's see if there are any more questions before moving on to this next topic of costs and benefits. Any questions? Okay, let's keep on. Costs and benefits of maintaining areas in a natural state. So one of the most important considerations, and probably the thing that resonates most effectively with our residents and our HOA board, is it costs a lot less to maintain a native prairie landscape. So if you're hiring contractors like we're doing here, And again, I'm not going to suggest this number is appropriate for every property. And in fact, some of our past contractors have told me that our budget is too low, but partly because most of our natural area is in relatively good shape, we're budgeting about $400 per acre per year. So you multiply that by roughly 20 acres and you can see what our budget is. This particular budget is about 1/4 of the amount that we spend for conventional turf ground landscape. So $400 per year for natural landscapes, about $1,500 or $1,600 per acre per year. Again, this is in landscape islands, and we've got some septic treatment areas which are in turf grass. That's what we're spending. So if we can do a good job of maintaining our natural areas, keep them in good shape, this is a huge benefit to keeping the budget of your HOA to a minimum. And those annual fees that you're paying into your HOA don't become sticker shock. So very important consideration. Next slide. Some other benefits is when you have deep-rooted native landscapes, and this image here, some of you may have seen, on the very left-hand side is turf grass. Turf grass has a root zone that goes down about 3 or 4 inches. That's why it doesn't deal very well with droughts or extreme temperatures. It dries out in the summertime because it doesn't have enough water. It has too much heat. Whereas the native plantings have root systems that go down eventually 3 feet, 5 feet, as much as 10 feet. So they're doing a very good job of surviving under conditions where where non-native plants wouldn't. So you don't need to water them, but those root systems also do a really good job of infiltrating rainwater and stormwater so that both recharges natural groundwater systems and protects water supplies and also recharges groundwater. I'm going to make another comment here, which might seem controversial because I suggested before that we do need to use herbicides in our native landscapes, but the amount of herbicide we're using is far, far, far less in terms of gallons per acre, or whatever unit you want to compare it to the amount that's typically put on by a chem lawn or some other, lawn company to manage turf grass. So if you think about it, in our particular subdivision is on well and septic. So basically we're drinking the water that resides 100 feet below our homes. If we're putting on lots of lawn chemicals, so if you're doing a native landscape and you're treating it appropriately and you're not using many chemicals, you have a huge benefit in terms of protecting water quality as well as water quantity in that underlying aquifer. So another important reason to go with native systems. Next slide. Some other benefits, this is getting into the kind of the butterflies and bees. We have within Bull Valley and several other towns in McHenry County have adopted something called the Mayor's Monarch Pledge, which is a national program that supports within communities maintaining and propagating and expanding vegetation that attracts monarch butterflies. So host plants would be milkweed, nectar plants would be everything from coneflowers to asters to goldenrods to many of the other species I mentioned above in some of the earlier slides. So very important in terms of creating and maintaining habitat for these kind of species, as well as other butterfly species, as well as bees, native bees, that kind of thing. So if you're into that, that's a very important consideration. Next slide. One other element, and again, this is somewhat subjective, and obviously everyone has a different interpretation, but I think I can say with probably unanimity, every resident that I speak with within my community, including some that used to be detractors, now say that they really love what they see behind their homes in this 20 acres of open space that, winds through the subdivision. So this is the kind of look that some might consider weedy. Our residents who have been educated and have kind of seen this evolve over time see this as an asset. And they're actually numbers that verify, and again, these are some national numbers put together by groups like the National Association of Realtors and others that suggest that these kind of natural landscapes, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned, that are adjacent or nearby residential communities can increase home values by anywhere from 8% to 20%. So that's a pretty good number. Again, I haven't tried to verify that by talking to local realtors, but having been kind of working in this area for many years, I think these numbers are probably valid from people I have spoken with. Next slide. All right, I'm going to take a quick break again. Any questions about costs and benefits before we move on? All right, let's keep going. We'll get outside fairly soon so you can enjoy this nice day. The last topic I want to talk about is something that's fairly unique to McHenry County, but it also, opportunities might exist in other counties as well. And that is to work with a land conservation organization. In this case, it's the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, to establish a relationship with the HOA to either donate or more likely put within a conservation easement the natural area within your HOA, so there can be management of that natural area by the Land Conservancy or by what other land conservancy might exist in your county if you're not from McHenry County. So one qualifier, and again, there aren't absolutely specific rules on this, but generally speaking, this wouldn't apply to every HOA. So if you're in say a new development where you have, I don't know, 10 acres of, prairie that was planted on top of an old cornfield, that may not apply. But if there are areas that are in your landscape that are of particular ecological or watershed significance, meaning they're, say, tributary to a headwater stream, they're adjacent high quality wetlands, they're particular soils, or they're adjacent to, say, a McHenry County Conservation District site or another important easement, this is something you should definitely seriously consider. So the HOA basically would then fund the Land Conservancy to manage these easements. And one thing the Land Conservancy does, just so they're protected in terms of their long-term commitment, is to make sure that they use an annual adjustment based on the consumer price index to increase the amount of the fee to basically be adequate for future management costs. So it's a really, I think, important vehicle, and I believe there are at least 4 different examples. I'll run through a few in just a second here, where the Land Conservancy has been working with HOAs and municipalities to make this happen, going back at least over the last 20 years or so. So next slide.
We have a couple questions, Dennis.
Okay, go ahead.
Charlotte is asking, do you have an example or template for how to implement the stewardship task into covenants declarations of HOAs?
I don't, other than I can certainly share what we're doing here in our HOA. The language is actually fairly simple. I did mention, and this is probably the best thing to do, and if you have difficulty finding it because it's not a standalone ordinance, but McHenry County has a conservation design ordinance within the Unified Development Ordinance. So if you get on, it's a little bit tricky if you're not familiar with these things. If you get on to the county's website, there's a list of ordinances. Then you have to go into the Unified Development Ordinance, and you have to kind of drill down to conservation design. And there's a whole bunch of criteria that are included in terms of the language that's associated with things like covenants, long-term management, how it's funded, et cetera, et cetera. And again, we probably don't have the time or the details to get into it today. And I can certainly talk to the person offline, or if you want to share that person's or share my email contact information with that person, I'd be glad to have a follow-up with them. But it can be fairly straightforward language. It can be much more complicated where, again, you have things like performance criteria and just really detailed language, but I don't think it has to be that detailed.
Okay, and then we do have another question. Nancy's asking, how do you suggest someone within an HOA someone living with an HOA, how do they start convincing their HOA to begin naturalizing some areas?
Well, for all the reasons above, I guess, I think the costs and benefits are fairly compelling. I can tell you there's going to be pushback because there is an initial cost up front, as I mentioned. If you're going from turf grass to a native prairie planting, you have to kill off the turf grass and then you have to plant a native prairie. The seed mixes themselves can cost easily $1,000 per acre. And then you need to hire a contractor. Ideally, like I wouldn't even say ideal. I would highly recommend you hire a contractor with skill in this. I believe one of the participants is David from Stantec. If David's still on, he might have some comments to offer maybe at the end on this topic because his company does that kind of work. But yeah, it's basically starting from scratch. What we see often is if they have problem areas within their development, I'm going to say often this is just around a detention basin where it looks very weedy. They've got Canada geese. They have vegetation they don't like. They have, again, some of these species like willows that are taking over. In many cases, they see that within their community, everyone sees it as an eyesore. So they do, in some cases like that, they do have the ability to justify the economic investment to do the right thing. So you're going to spend some money up front, but you're going to save money in the long term. There have been some economic analyses to get a little bit further into the weeds that have been done that show the long-term cost benefits, not just year to year, but if you do have to spend the money up front, how long will it take you to recoup the costs, considering you're spending less per year, but you spend that money up front compared to turf grass, which costs, if you do have common areas in turf grass, it costs you a lot more per year to, again, mow that grass and, control the weeds. So typically the numbers I've seen, it costs anywhere, or it takes anywhere from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years before you reach that break-even point. So again, if you are going to do that conversion, you have to make that case to your HOA. And you could certainly get, some bids or estimates from a reputable native landscape contractor who has done exactly this kind of work. Some of these firms pride themselves in doing that kind of work and doing these kind of conversions. So there are plenty of examples out there. And I think that's the other thing to do is find some local on the ground examples where they've done that conversion, talk to them, get their references. Ideally, take some pictures, go out to their site, show them what it looks like. And I should have said this up front, but while there's not much to look at now, if anybody wants to come out in the growing season, typically from May through October, and visit our site, there is an easement on McAndrews Glen, which is where I live. I'm sorry, on Milburn Court, which is the center of the 3 little cul-de-sacs. There's an easement with an entry sign that gives you access to the nature preserve. You can see what it looks like, or you can just drive through the development. You can see what it looks like in the different growing seasons. In some cases, that's enough to convince someone that's at least worth having a conversation. So that's just kind of me thinking out loud, the kind of arguments I would use if I was trying to convince someone to make a change.
Okay, I think that's it with the questions for now.
Okay. So I'm going to give 3 quick examples. These are from the Land Conservancy of McHenry County, 3 different subdivisions where they've worked with HOAs. And in some cases, I think they worked with the developer before it actually got turned over to the HOA to establish these management areas. The first is Apple Creek Estates in Woodstock. This is a 29-acre conservation easement, although I believe some of this also includes an actual donation of property from the HOA to the Land Conservancy. So it gets a little bit complicated. And again, you can always talk to Lisa Hatterline, who is the executive director of the Land Conservancy. She'd be more than willing to have a conversation with you about these kind of opportunities. So the reason this was basically put aside as an easement with the Land Conservancy is that this is adjacent to a very significant property to the north, which includes land owned by, actually the Defenders own some of this land, the Conservation District, I believe the Soil and Water Conservation District, and the city of Woodstock own some land to the north. And then some of the areas shaded in blue, which is the actual easement, are in a creek corridor, which is the headwaters to the Nippersink, or Kishwaukee River, I should say, which is a very high quality stream. So basically that was the rationale for doing this particular easement. And again, the Land Conservancy receives annual funds from the HOA to do the management of these areas. So that's one example. Next slide. The next example, I think this is a little bit more recent. This is Dutch Creek in Johnsburg. Dutch Creek is a tributary to, I believe, the Fox River directly. Nancy or Cindy, you may have more information. It's part of an ongoing watershed initiative. Yeah, it's part of an ongoing watershed initiative where Boone Creek, which is the watershed we're in, and Dutch Creek are part of a watershed group where they're doing lots of planning. So this is a very important easement. It's in, again, the village of Johnsburg, and it involves, in part, the Remington Grove subdivision, which I think is in the upper part of the slide. And again, it's a little bit more complicated as you go further downstream, but you can see this is a linear easement along Dutch Creek, which has some high quality areas, including some fens and seeps, which are fairly rare and uncommon. So it's very important to protect these kind of headwater systems. And again, the HOA pays the Land Conservancy to manage this area in perpetuity. Next example is on the next slide. This is a site called Horsefair Springs in Spring Grove. Cindy, you may be more familiar with this. This is about a 9-acre easement. This is in a headwater area. I assume this is the Nippersink Creek. I could be wrong. It's fairly near Nippersink Creek. And it's adjacent to an Illinois Natural Inventory site, which is a designation only applied to some of the highest quality remnants left in the state of Illinois. So it has some, in this case, I believe, significant wetland and maybe fen resources. And again, the Land Conservancy has an easement and a perpetual management agreement with funding from the HOA to manage these areas. I believe that's the last slide. We'll go on, next slide. I think it's time to kind of sit back and answer any remaining questions. If there are any comments, we've got a little bit of time left here to indulge whatever you have. Any questions, comments?
Well, Dennis, someone asks, what's the best way to eradicate Phragmites? Good luck answering that question. This person says they've got a patch that started as one stalk and it's now 400 feet square.
All right. I would say get yourself a backpack sprayer with 5% Roundup. Make sure if it's a really wet area, make sure it's the Roundup that's appropriate for application in wet areas and spray away. I'm being a little bit flippant, but that's what we do here. If it's a concentrated area, and again, if you have it on your site, you know how aggressive it can be and how tall it can be. In some cases, we had some on our property that was as much as 12, maybe even 14 feet tall. So it's almost difficult to spray with a backpack sprayer. You typically want to wait until later in the growing season where it's fully vegetated out. And typically we treat it in August. You want to treat it maybe as it's starting to come into flower, but you don't want to wait so long where it goes to seed and those seeds spread. The key thing with Phragmites, again, giant reed is another name for it, is it's rhizomatous, so it spreads underground. It can grow right up a hillside. So while it likes wet areas, it isn't necessarily limited to wet areas. Once you get it under control to some extent, you can go back it's going to be a 3 or 4 year process, most likely. You can go back then and treat individual plants. You can treat them either with spray, or better yet, there's a method where you take basically a cloth or a cotton glove on the outside of a rubber glove, and you just put herbicide in the glove and you treat the stem. You literally go right up the stem with that. You can clip the stem and put concentrated Roundup on the stem, so you're not killing any adjacent vegetation. But we have found in our site where we have killed it. This isn't in the HOA, although we've had a little bit in the HOA. In the adjacent nature preserve, we've killed it off, and within those same areas, we're getting, just from the seed bank, we're getting really good wetland plants like sedges and other wildflowers coming into the area that Phragmites used to exist in. So that's my Phragmites treatment 101. Let me ask, David, are you on the call here? Dave Bart, or no? You can raise your hand if you are. If you have any thoughts on some of these technical questions that I'm answering, feel free to offer suggestions. I guess Dave's not on, but.
Well, Jonathan, someone named Jonathan who just he has a question about who could he get for advice on something like this. A couple of us suggested the Wildflower Preservation and Propagation Committee, but I bet he'd like other advice that you can give about who could he call to get advice.
Could you hear me right now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you're starting from scratch, like I said, I would go back to the reference that I posted early on. And then I would, basically talk to anybody you can. I won't offer analyst services, but I'd happy to have a conversation, a brief conversation at least. If Nancy or Cindy, if you request from them, they can share my email contact information. Contact the Land Conservancy of McHenry County if there may be an opportunity there. If you're familiar with other areas where they have done a good job, other HOAs, I mean, talk to residents. I think the Defenders is developing a database of contacts with other HOAs. So I don't know if that database includes, whether or not they're maintaining natural areas, but I'm guessing Cindy or Nancy could maybe share some of that information with you. And I think it would be a good thing. I'm just kind of thinking out loud now, as this topic moves forward, as we get more information, if other HOAs are willing to put themselves out there and say, yeah, we're happy with what we're doing. We've learned, there's some lessons from our experience, both pros and cons. We'd be happy to talk to other HOAs. To me, that's really the best way to get information. Talk to people who have gone through and are going through something similar to what you've been through, and you'll get a pretty fair and honest evaluation and response to your questions. And you can call contractors and have them come out and visit and say, hey, we're thinking about this. Do you have any thoughts? And before they do an actual estimate, I think many of them are willing to at least have a conversation with you. And as I mentioned before you make a selection, I would get feedback from several and maybe even get 2 or 3 competing bids once you've kind of honed in on exactly what you want to do, to know what it might cost, and then kind of go from there. So those are just some thoughts I have. And in general, there are some municipal contacts. I think I listed Crystal Lake and Algonquin before in terms of having some conservation design ordinance language. There are people in both of those communities and probably others who have done this for a lot of their parkland, some of their common areas. Algonquin is one of the leaders in the entire region in doing this. Michelle Zimmerman on staff in their public works department. I think she's retiring soon, but she would be glad to answer questions, I believe.
She's retiring today.
Oh, she is. Well, congratulations, Michelle. So anyway, yeah, those are some people you might want to consider.
I'd like to mention also to anyone interested in that very question, on June 26th, we have another BMP event coming up. Sarah Bosca from Bluestem, I can't think of the name of her company now, Bluestem, whatever it is.
Services.
Yeah, she is going to be giving a presentation and a little tour of the naturalized area that they have developed now around the Woodstock Library. And that's where they just started from scratch and last year started naturalizing it. So you might want to watch for our information about that upcoming BMP event on June 26th. And that could give you maybe some ideas of how you could start naturalizing an area in your HOA as well. So
it's a good idea. And I should mention too, it's probably self-evident, but you don't have to, just jump in and do full bore all of your common open space. You could start out with something as small as a ½ acre or 1 acre, see how it works, see what the costs are looking like. And then if everybody's on board, you kind of expand from there. So that's definitely a consideration.
And in case some of you didn't notice, Cindy has been placing excellent references in the chat. And before we end this event, you might want to go into the chat and quickly copy those links onto your computer. So
we can also post these in a blog post coinciding with when we post this video. So all of those resources will be available after, either in the YouTube video or the blog post.
Okay.
Hey, this is John. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
All right, hi. Thanks for the advice on, breaking ground at the HOA, like I'm trying to do with these street-facing gardens at the entrance. About Phragmites, I used to work on a crew doing the same thing. We even had the glove on and herbicided the glove, and then ran our glove up the stem. Um, so yeah, that's all good too, and also for cattail. And now that reminds me of my alma mater, Loyola. There's a team of grad students that they've been doing this now for I think 10 years. They call themselves Team Typha. Typha is the genus name of cattail, Typha. If we're gonna create a blog post with these helpful links, uh, I'd like someone to put something there about Team Typha if you don't mind Googling that. Um, yeah, they take a harvester and they harvest that biomass above ground and they pelletize it and then they can use it for fuel. But more than that, they might have some helpful advice on how to tackle Phragmites, if it's anything like Typha. So yeah, there's my little comment there if that might help with Phragmites control.
Thanks, Jonathan. And let me make another, I should have mentioned this before, in terms of advice on control. If you want to do some of this on your own, or even just have the knowledge before you hire a contractor, the Illinois Nature Preserves Commission, also known as INPC, has a very detailed set of management guidelines online that give detailed advice on control of almost all the significant invasive species, including some of the aggressive native species like tall goldenrod that I mentioned before online. I don't know the exact link, but if you Google Illinois Nature Preserves Commission management guidelines, and Cindy, maybe you can put this in the chat. You can get to their website and get to that grouping, and then it gives you a whole list you can just scroll through of individual invasive species. So, Canada thistle, reed canary grass, sweet clover. There's probably a good, I don't know, 40 or 50 species. And so that's also a good spot to go with, or a good set of information to go with. And it includes a kind of a range of techniques and approaches depending on how much of it you have, whether you're treating it in an area that's fairly sensitive with other, nice native species, or whether it's just an area that's, you can kind of go in with a kind of a heavy duty approach and use certain chemicals that you might not use in other areas. So it lists all the chemicals and in many cases a concentration and that kind of thing. So probably one of the best resources I can think of if you're looking for personal information on techniques for controlling individual invasive species.
I found the link and put it in the chat.
Thank you.
Oh, Nancy, you're talking, but you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I was coughing and I put myself on mute and forgot. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, we want to thank Dennis profusely. My goodness, that was a lot of information, Dennis. I'm so happy that it's recorded. And there are people that have said thank you to you, just so you know, in the chat. I bet you didn't get a chance to look, but there are thank yous coming in. So,
Yeah.
And then Grace will let us know via the e-news. And Grace, I don't know if there's any other way to let people know, but she'll let us know when the YouTube video is available for this as well. And as a result, someone like Jonathan, who said, how can you get this going? How do you get this started in your HOA or along the curbs in your neighborhood in Woodstock or whatever? Maybe you could have a little gathering at your house and watch it over again so that everyone could get that information. So thank you, Dennis.
Yeah, I can send out a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this webinar that gives them the link to the video, and we can add some of these resources that Dennis has and others have provided us.
Perfect.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks for everyone who attended.
I'll just close by saying again, you're welcome to come out and take a look, and remind you again, the Land Conservancy in McHenry County has a lot of events where we kind of use the HOA property as part of our kind of introductions. We walk through things like pollinator walks. I think next week they're doing a skunk cabbage walk. Not that you'll find that in a lot of HOAs, but it's a really cool spring wildflower. So get on their, their mailing list for those kinds of events as well.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
Enjoy the first day of spring.
Oh yeah, happy spring.